Welcome to everyone who's joined us. I'm Rebecca Kosick, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Bristol, and I run a research cluster called In-Disciplinary Poetics. And so tonight's discussion is one of the events that we offer through the research cluster, which explores relationships between poetry and other disciplines and fields of practice. I want to say thank you also to the Bristol Poetry Institute, who's co-hosting this event tonight. It's part of the Lyra Festival wider program, and we're delighted to be able to participate in that program. And I also want to say a really enthusiastic welcome to Sarah Tremlett, who's joining us tonight for this discussion. So we are going to be talking about her book that has just come out, or is just about to come out. I think it's just coming out in the UK, but about to come out in the US. Is that right?
Yeah. It'll come out in America in May, actually. So, but it's out in the UK now.
So stay tuned to folks over across the Atlantic. But for now, if you're interested in purchasing a copy, I'll drop a link in the chat in just a moment. But first I'll say that Sarah Tremlett is a poetry filmmaker, a video poet, and theorist who particularly looks into the connective aesthetics and the philosophy of poetry film. She's also the co-director of Liberated Words Poetry Film Events and the editor of Liberated Words Online. And she's been a judge at numerous international festivals. She's given presentations on her own poetry films all over the world. And she's here tonight to talk to us about her new book, The Poetics of Poetry Film. So we'll kick off the discussion with sort of a potentially sort of straightforward question just to kind of get us into the topic. But Sarah, would you maybe give us a little bit of an overview of the book and sort of tell us a little bit about your practice as a poetry filmmaker and a researcher and how the project kind of came to be?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for this. It's wonderful. I don't know if you can see, there's the book. It's so it's 400 pages, it's about 80 color illustrations, and it covers the history, all the different streams that flow into the subject of poetry film. So the history of poetry from, you know, pre-Christian era really, the visual poetry and lyric poetry, through to the film, the birth of film, to all of the stages that actually feed into where we are today in the digital world. And I cover, mostly the book is about form. Obviously, there are people who are leading practitioners have written their own essays on their own work. So there are multiple voices in there. But essentially, the book is about form and the different forms of poetry film. We have very good contributions from Charles Olson on Spanish video poets, and Thomas Zandagiacomo del Bel from Zebra, who has given a great overview of films from the festival. Marisol Belusqui's work on Argentinian video poetry and the history behind the rise of video poetry in Argentina. So there's a whole cross section around the world of how we are where we are today, really. And of course, that's changed quite a lot since 2000, with the rise of the accessible editing programs for everybody and the iPhone, etc. So it's becoming more and more common now to be able to make a poetry film. Essentially, the book takes the structures that you'd find in poetry itself. It could be metaphor or text, tonality, the voice, time, and each of these are discussed in much more depth so that you get a feeling of how poetry film has its own screen poetry, its own way of being, which is beyond that of poetry on the page or the spoken word, and in fact binds those two in a way that an artist like Marinetti, when he first discussed cinematic poems, he was equally happy talking about the lyrical aspect of the Futurist Manifesto with object poetry as well. He didn't see it inimical to combine the two concepts of the lyric and the object poem, the visual poem. So I think that now we're at a point where his dream would have been realized, really. I came to this writing this book. I mean, it began in about 2005 when I switched from being a visual artist to working more with text on screen. And I was doing a degree at that point. And the people who I was inspired by were Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger, female artists who were working with text, and also gender and the gaze and power, abuse of power. And this was inspiring me at the time. And so I went from that to beginning a research project on working with minimal poetry, minimal text-based poetry that would, I wanted to connect up with the both the cyclical form in page-based verse and the metronomic form. I wanted to take the essentials of page-based verse and explore those, but on the moving screen. And at this time, that was very unfashionable. Mostly media poets were going out there being incredibly amazing with code-based poetry, and really weren't interested in looking back at the page very much at the time. So I was sort of in this strange world and began to do a research project on that. Then I met Tom Conovies at a Berry Festival of Text in 2009. And he liked some of my work and wanted to show some of my work. And at the same time, he was formulating what I think the Video Poetry Manifesto. And then in 2010, I met Lucy English, and at a conference again when I was showing something very, very conceptual, which was an interaction of my voice with a scanning probe microscope. And I think that was probably the most conceptual I've been so far, because my work is very much about researching and playing with text and the screen and the voice. And so Lucy came at this from one direction, and I came at it from another, and we joined up to make Liberated Words and had our first festival at Mix in 2012. And then we've gone on from that since with annual festivals. And my work became much more about sort of perhaps tailored towards festival showing, which means condensed 3-minute, 5-minute works that are more, perhaps less conceptual and more acceptable, perhaps, to everybody in general. So yeah, so that's now it's taken me, I began the book in 2015, I think. And so that's how long it's taken me. It's a labor of love, really.
Well, I'm really lucky to be one of its early readers. It was such a pleasure to read your book, and it's encyclopedic, as you've been describing. It covers so many aspects of the form and also related forms. So I know part of its purpose then is, of course, to bring out the kind of diversity of poetry films and their related works. So, of course, with the caveat that no one example could be representative of the breadth of the genre that you really get into in the book and you can really see as a reader of your book. I thought maybe we've asked you to select a clip to share with us, so just so the audience can kind of get a sense for what a poetry film is, especially for people that might be new to the genre. So shall I play the first clip from the video?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. All right, so let me know if this is working okay.
Turns out.
Let me start it. So can you see this okay?
Yep.
Turns out, no desk for me in business continuity room. No login for secure SATCOM.
No help from help desk.
I'll believe anything. For instance, I'll believe A. There is a corner in that empty bottle. B. Soon we are leaving in this airplane I drew. C. If I turn quickly, if I jump, I can see myself in the past. I had such a nice future. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I am calling on my eye block. From this desk woven of twigs, high insecure tree.
Hello. Hello.
Turn on camera. The awful teeth pull back to show smoking footprints crisscross the lawn. Our turn. Our turn. Our turn.
No help from help desk. Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Shall I say something about it, Rebecca?
Yeah, please. Maybe tell us a little bit about sort of how it demonstrates some of the aspects of how poetry film works, as well as the interface between the text and the visual and the oral.
Yes. I mean, it was very hard for me to pick one film because originally we were going to pick, I mean, there are other excerpts coming up, aren't there? But when I just thought, well, one film, I actually did end up on this film because Martha McCulloch is a top video poet. And I remember when we saw this in 2013, I think it was, submitted to Liberated Words. And it's never gone away from me, the craftsmanship in this film. And also it's been very popular online. It's had over 2,500 views. So it's doing something right, which I'm not going to say that's a good, way to identify a good film. But however, anyway, within this film, you have, the theme of isolation and a sort of a society that we're in at the moment, actually, really, in many ways, where we are kind of marooned in industrial nightmares, industrial economic complexes where you really don't have any help from anybody. And I think that this film is so clever because you have the grid, and the grid also suggests perhaps somebody is watching you, monitoring you, and it's a kind of militarized eye, and the coloring, again, quite bleached out. But at the same time as you have that idea of a world that we all recognize, within it is this intentional, when I say intentional, I mean within the mind, coming from the inner thoughts of the person, is art. They're sort of with the wolves and the snow, like the bleakness and the wind. That's as if we're in her mind, with her voice distant, otherworldly, detached, and yet we understand the extensional world, the objective world too. So we're sort of floating like she is, and sort of we're lulled in as well, in the same way that you might be with that muzak that you get in those sorts of places, where really you are encouraged to sort of disappear in a sense. And I feel that this does this in quite a simple but extraordinary way. This film does a very, very good job. But also in terms of the rhythms on screen, the way that you have a repetitive sort of metronomic beat that's going, that's sort of redolent of an industrial, mechanical process, and coupled with the repetition of the wolves and the people running, that makes a sort of cyclical patterning as well, and the voice. So altogether, we are sort of being sucked in through rhythm, through the texture of the sound, texture of the screen. So I think I could talk about this, for for quite a long time, but basically it's such a short film too, isn't it? But yet it gets over, unfortunately, how a lot of our world is today. So,
Thanks. Maybe stepping back a bit, just to kind of, I know
I
I've been.
forgot to say one thing, sorry.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Sorry, because you wanted that point, you have a voiceover, but you also have the text on screen. And that's not, some people do that. Dave Richardson does that. Not everybody can do that and do it successfully. And I think she balanced the voiceover with the text on the screen. Just the editing of that was just so nicely done that you heard the voice, saw the text on the screen, moved on, you know. So I think that was another very good aspect of that film.
Yeah, definitely. And also, just now that you're hinting at this, you know, that different filmmakers make different kind of approaches to the relationship of text and screen and the visual and the verbal. I know also one thing that comes out in your book is that there's poetry film. But maybe if we step back a little bit, you also bring up the fact that there are kind of, you know, different examples and different terminologies, and without getting too deep into the weeds of the different terms, but I know, so of course there's poetry film, but also video poetry. And you bring up a kind of spectrum of practices that, as you know, range from the kind of more conceptual, like some of the things that you were mentioning in your own work earlier, to sort of, you know, adaptations of lyric poems. And so there's different strategies there. Could you maybe talk a little bit about these different types or combinations or approaches?
Yes, well, sure. Talking about historically, I suppose, for people who don't know. Actually, we've got here some little excerpts. We've got The Night Before Christmas, a small excerpt from that, and Anemic Cinema. I think that's what I got here. But to say that the original, in actual fact, poetry films were one of the first forms of as intertitles, were the first forms of poetry on film, in fact, starting with The Night Before Christmas in 1905, but it was only a little tester, really, for the Edison Company. And I've got a little excerpt of that. Then Marinetti, of course, worked with other people and with the Futurists to make Futurist Life and some other films. And that film now has gone. If somebody finds that film, it'll be worth a fortune, which was made in, I think, 1916. I cannot be totally sure about that. But that film was an experimental film, silent film. And on to 1921 with Manhattan by Sheila and Strand in New York, which included poetry by Walt Whitman, again, and as intertitles, and scenes of Manhattan at the time. And then we have sort of switching to Paris and the Surrealists and Man Ray and Duchamp. And Duchamp made one of his, then the film poem, which was mainly rhythm without words at all, just rhythm and light. That was what was prevalent at the time. But Duchamp did something slightly different in that he made a rotating text on screen, which were aphorisms. And I've argued that this is like a radical new form of the verse, really, because it includes the cyclical turning of the verse. Then you didn't have very many examples through to the 30s or 40s. It was England with the documentary. Poetry was used in documentaries, and which also shifted to Canada as well. And then film poetry, well, experimental films through the 40s and 50s in America and California. As I said before, Jonas Mekas identified as film poems and called film poems. And Hans Richter, of course, took the concept of the film poem. But by about the 70s, or actually mid-60s, I've got an example of the term poetry film in my book. Just before, in fact, Herman Ballant used it in the 70s for his festival, which was specifically for poetry, poems in films. And then, of course, we have the advent of video poetry. We move on from there through to the digital era. These different types of film, the poetry film centers on poetry in the film. And of course, with video poetry, Tom Convies wrote his manifesto in 2011 to define what he felt was video poetry, which video poetry is one word, not video poetry, which is two words, which is another term, in fact, for a poetry film, really, and often used in the Spanish-speaking countries. But his definition was to kind of separate out a very a type of work which sort of has no poem that's the text, the text that's a main text before the film, which you actually refer back to. The poem itself is in the commingling of the text, the image, and the soundscape on screen. And for that definition, you can look at people. I mean, Martha McCulloch's work there is a video poem, very definitely. I think he wants to see the text as another element within the whole. And each part of the film, the video poem, is working to make the whole poem itself. That does happen in poetry films too. It's a very funny crossover there, and it is quite a delicate discussion that needs further discussion, in fact.
Yeah, and it seems like there's still a lot of porosity between these different kinds of categories. Yeah.
I mean, the film poem definition is clear, but anyhow, you could see, if you wanted to, just see the little excerpts.
Yeah. So should we show the next clip then? All right, here we go. And the next one too, right?
It's coming up. There you are. So that's Anemic Cinema.
Yeah, these are amazing. Thank you so much for sharing the clips too during this conversation. Your book prompted me to think about, I guess, what is a really fundamental kind of question to ask. But it's sort of, what does it mean for a poem to be a film, right? So I was reading some work by the scholar Ben Bolig, who's written about the sort of phenomenon of poetry's use in films, but not what you would call a poetry film. So, but one of the things that kind of comes up a lot of times is that when films are called poetic, like maybe by reviewers or people who are watching them, they sort of use that to refer to something that takes place in the film that kind of departs from a more standard narrative structure. So if it does something, takes up kind of vanguard strategies or makes a particularly strong aesthetic appeal or affective appeal, perhaps at the expense of some kind of story. So where, it does something a bit experimental and sort of non-narrative. But so in your book, you raise these points often with regard to the different kind of branches of poetry film. So again, like coming back to Tom Convies' categories that you just mentioned, sort of conceptual video poems, he says, exclude narrative and hold little intentional semantic value. But then you also address narrative poetry films and the ways in which these films generate signification, right? So they definitely are interested in meaning then through metaphor and other sort of strategies familiar to poetry. So my question here is sort of, if we're not thinking about the poetic as just some kind of like loose floating signifier for when films do weird things, right? Which I think is what sometimes happens when reviewers kind of refer to films as poetic. You know, how do you see the poetic, or where do you see the poetic as sort of living for the poetry film?
Yes. Well, I think there's two questions there. So I'm going to answer, I think the first one was, what does it mean for a poem to be a film? And I think that there's some very practical answers to that one, which is that usually the poetry film very often is collaboration. And that opens up the poem to revisioning, to being revisioned. And, you know, even if it's the same person making the film as the poet, that there will be differences and expansion on the original. Audience numbers, what it means is that a wider audience will definitely get to hear that poem, see that poem. If it's a political poem, if it's subjective, I speak quite a lot about the subjectivity and the importance of the poetry film in terms of subjectivity and voice. So that, of course, expands, the poetry film can expand what the original poem was aiming to do. And the reverse of that is that it can bring an audience back to the poet when they're sitting reading live. And then, of course, technically, the poem can, although anyone can read a poem on the page, if it's the poet's own voice, you can technically, of course, it could be anyone in the poetry film reading that poem. And so there are lots of things that expand the poem in terms of what it means for a poem to be a film. So where is the poetic in the film, which is this very interesting question. So I mean, it's quite a large question. I'm going to have condensed it down as much as I can, I think. So the theme and the content in a poem and in a poetry film can be very different. You can be talking about love, unhappiness in love, and see a ball bouncing across the screen, and you immediately understand the meaning behind the you know, the ups and downs of emotion. In terms of rhythm on the screen, T. Hume talked about the original verse form as being a hypnotic form that was meant to sort of hypnotize you and affect the listener, whereas imagism was meant to arrest you and grab the listener, the viewer, sorry. And I think those two forms, if you think of those two forms with the lyric and the way that poetry films operate, you get a combination of that happening in a poetry film that's completely acceptable.
Yeah.
So that's another unique thing. And that also plays back into the spatio-temporal surface. The screen poem is an event. It's an event that is happening with all different things happening, with perceptual effects, and so that you have narration and monstration at the same time. You have sequence and you have synchronicity at the same time. And these things are a magic conflation, if you like. So this makes different editing choices for the poetry film from the poem, of course. The spatial choices, whether you want to make a subject opaque or transparent on the screen, those things, all of those things are extraneous to the written poem. And as I say, I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but the revisioning that's going on is very exciting. And the poetry film, unlike other short films, can be entirely about tonality. I mean, really, it can be eidetic with just tonal qualities, small pieces of text. No other film would be like that. but in essence, what the poetry film is, it's an extension of the page and the voice combined. And that's, if you really think about that, I mean, I was very much into philosophy of language when I was starting out doing my research, reading a lot of the French philosophers and Irigaray and Kristeva, and I was very heavy duty thinking going on. But I actually feel that the poetry film is loaded with a philosophy of language that just needs to be, I'm tipping, you know, at the edge of it, talking about it. And it's all happening for us on the screen. And mainly because also what's exciting, it's this combination of philosophy of practice, let's say, with poetry. And of course, those were often separate, completely separate and culturally, traditionally. So that's exciting too. I was just going to come on to one of the main things with the poetry film, though, is as a mnemonic space. It's often used to say, to have how the past haunts the present, and using layering as well, layering techniques too. And one example of this is Tiptoe by Rhian Edwards, and with a black and white screen and the rain falling. And she's clearly haunted by what's happened in the past. It might be quite simple in a way, but actually I find it extremely effective. So we could perhaps see that film.
Yeah.
I wander dreamless through your dialogues, the ephemera of affection. I trape shoeless through these dialects, these contentious claims to passions. I press these brittle souls upon the fire-licked blistered coals, upon the stain that broke the glass, upon the eggshells and kid gloves, and through the splinters, flints and shards, I forged these uneroded paths. And yet I tiptoe through your daydreams, the outcast your trances toyed at night, and meanwhile, buoyed by moons and frozen sheets, I thumped the thinning ice, so I meander through the arid, abandoning beds where I've expired. I'm walking dead to you, bereft of you, with crumbs of poems left of you, armed with a memory now for forgetting you.
Yeah. So I just would like to say one more thing about the voice, and that is that the voiceover, where the voice is placed. I mean, in narrative forms, you have the diegetic voice and the intradiegetic voice and the extra. And in the poetry film, it can be totally uncertain where that voice lies. It's a voice over your shoulder. It's not like a voiceover in a standard film, in effect. It's a voice that could be from inside the mind, an intentional, you know, inner mind thoughts, but not necessarily. And where the voice is positioned, for me, is, I sort of argued that there's an indirectly intradiegetic voice. So it's a voice that belongs to what you see, but it's indirectly, technically and physically, materially, it belongs to what you see, but it doesn't, in another way, it doesn't. And so that's a whole area where the voice lies, which is very fascinating, and not the same for other forms of short film. So yeah, so that for me, I'd say, is one of the principles, the use of memory and where the position of the voice is very important.
Yeah, I love what you're saying too, all throughout this discussion about just the collaborative nature of poetry film, which takes on both kind of practical aspects in terms of multiple people participating in the production of the films, but also in the ways that kind of poetry and film each lend to the other, the affordances of their genre in order to kind of extend the possibilities of both. But I wanted to come back, I think, specifically to Metaphor, which is a very, well-known poetry friend, let's say. And I was thinking about the different kinds of tools that are available to the poetry filmmaker and how they lend themselves to the generation of images, maybe more broadly, including via metaphor. But so, you know, like for lyrical poetry, when we talk about images, we're often talking about the kind of mind's eye images that are created by the things that the reader is reading. And then, you know, for concrete poetry and visual poetry, these images might be actual, or there might be actual images plus the mind's eye images, right? But you point out in your book that, as I'll quote you, you say, in poetry film, metaphor can exist in the poem, the visual filmic interpretation, as well as additional verbal or visual text, plus the soundscape. And that's the end of the quote. But so some of these different kinds of vehicles, as you call them, can be up to different things too. And I was just thinking about that when we were watching Tiptoe, because when you read the title of the poem, you immediately get that kind of mind's eye image of the tiptoe, but the first visual image that we see in the actual screen is of the raindrops. And those are kind of competing, or complementing each other, or both, right? But so can you talk a little bit maybe about this kind of how filmmakers use these different image generating tools from the different kind of fields of practice that are intersecting in poetry film?
Yes, I mean, you have the filmmaker I was going to mention this a bit later, but the filmmaker comes along, not necessarily, and I mean, ideally, it's said that poetry film the filmmaker shouldn't illustrate directly their poem, although in fact that can be done, has been done, and has been done very well. But ideally, it's not necessarily a direct translation of the images that the poet has provided. So then you're going to get parallelism happening, or as you say, metaphor, which another term for metaphor is elision, which means the process of both joining or merging, but also verbal omission. So you have these strange, these create different, I mean, this is very complex. So you'd have to analyze one particular poem in some depth, but you have the temporal sequence of the verse or the words being spoken, plus the images which are happening synchronously, as I was saying before. And if you altered those words just a bit, the metaphor is changed completely, or the inference and the association is changed completely. So exactly where everything is placed in a poetry film usually has a purpose, though it may not be directly understood to be so. And I thought one way of either through sameness and difference, we can look at sameness and difference, or an unexpected regularity or irregularity. These things are happening, and they're pushing our minds on this little journey that we're going through to sort of slightly push us in a certain direction, or have a certain feeling, or have a certain approach. I mean, Roland Barthes talked about the floating chain of signifieds, and I really like that phrase. He was talking about advertisements, about the rhetoric of the image, and so he would talk. He mentioned that there was the linguistic message and the one second, I'm just going to bring it up because I can't remember it straight off my head. So that there was the polysemous, the verbal. He's saying that all the linguistic message, the coded iconic message, and the literal message are all polysemous. They're both verbal and visual, and they imply a floating chain of signifieds which we select or ignore. And he says techniques are used to fix that floating chain of signifieds. And I effectively think that that's really what does happen in a poetry film, which seems to be running loose, but you keep on catching parts that have deeper meaning, have motifs, in fact, that's a form that happens in sound and in the image, is the concept of the motif. So, yes, as you say, the poem has its metaphors and sense of parallelism, and the film does too. So you might be having a sort of quadrupling effect happening. I don't think that the contemporary work that we do now has that axial, the metaphor is somehow splitting the metonymic sequence that Mayor Deren and others have talked about. I think now we have the screen that is, a temporal screen space that is beyond axial ways of thinking about poetry. And that's another completely, I can't really go into that now, but that I sincerely think that. And I don't think an axial concept, also actually Jacobson found that very hard to argue. People have said, well, it's all very well saying this, but how do you put that into practice? And he didn't ever really argue that. But I'd like to bring now a film where, conversely, it's rather like saying, do you believe in God? And people will say, oh, I don't know. But you say, do you believe in the devil? And you would say, yes. And I do think, that if it's very hard not to have metaphor. It's very hard because we think conceptually, we do think through conceptual metaphor. And I just wanted to show this film by Mark Ney's poem by Cindy St-Onge, which encapsulates a dream world. And I had heard that in reverie, the state of reverie normally belongs to the narrative chain, so that you have reverie is a separation away from logical thinking, if you like. But in the dream world, you just go from one image to another in your dreams, don't you? Well, Mark Nays has done this, but I don't really see it as metaphor. I see the world that he has created is it gives you a feeling of being isolated and sort of dislocated. But so I think this is a very, very clever film. We have a next excerpt.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of these clips with us. So I think maybe I have time for one more question from me, and then we will open it up to a couple of questions from the audience. And so I guess just getting back to the interface between poetry and the film, if there is one, or the porous interface. One thing that I found so fascinating, so I also work on translation in addition to poetry, and one thing that I found like really fascinating in your book, so you quote the linguist Roman Jakobson, who's got this notion of intersemiotic translation, which has to do with not translation between sort of spoken languages, but translation between different regimes of expression, right? So sort of translating, you know, a lyrical poem to a film, or a story to a painting, or something like this, right? Mm-hmm. And you say about that, not about the use of actual interlingual translations in the form of subtitling or other, you know, interlingual kind of things that happen when films are presented abroad or things like this. But you say about the relationship between the poem and the film, if that is one of translation, you say there is no mistranslation in this situation. And that to me was just so fascinating, thinking about the idea that whatever the film sort of does as a translation of the poem, if that's the way the poem and the film are working, which I know it's not always the case, but sometimes is, that there's no landing point that could possibly be an error, and that the translation is always sort of open then in that sense. And I found that really encouraging and generative for thinking about. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about kind of thinking about how this notion of intersemiotic translation kind of unlocks the translatability of poetry in all of these kind of ways.
Yeah, I think that. So when I made that comment, it was that was definitely that the can be no, it's the filmmaker that, and the way that they translate something is up to them to a degree. And I know that a lot of poets would argue with this, but I'm not talking about translation in the sense of translating from one language to another at all, which of course I feel strongly should reflect the original language and take into account that and enable us to understand what the original language was saying. I'm talking about how the filmmaker, as an artist, has the possibility to do what they want. It may not be successful to everybody. That's what I was saying then. But do you want me to talk about quickly where actual translation in films?
Yeah, if you'd like to, or we can turn it over to the audience. So if people are thinking of questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll come to those in just a second. Yeah. I'll
just mention it. So I don't know if there's time. Do you want to show the celebration by?
Sure.
And then we'll stop. But this is one example of how music also underpins translation and the emotive depth of this piece, with the translation by Catherine Cobham in this work.
Thanks.
Mr. Pop. كنت أبحث عن الفرق بين الثورة والحرب عندما عبرت رصاصة جسدي. Mr. Pop. في مدينة أعيد إعمارها مثل برلين يكمن السر الذي يعرفه الجميع، وهو أن لا، لن أكرر ما هو معروف، لكنني سأخبركم بما لا تعرفون. ليست مشكلة الحرب في من يموتون، مشكلتها في من يبقون أحياء بعدها.
Thank you. I love that one too, and the ways in which the intersemiotic and the interlingual are coexistent and sort of offering opportunities to the viewer to kind of have access to language and from multiple directions at the same time. That's lovely. Thank you. All right, so I think we have some in the chat and some in the Q&A. So let's take a look. So I think this first question from Shira came in during the first video of Martha McCullough's. Is that right? That was the first video. And she asks here about, was the original text evolved for a video poem or for text only, and who drew the visual art? Did the same person choose or create the audio? So, I mean, I know this is something that's come up throughout our talk, is that it can work in different ways. But do you happen to know about that first example, how it came to be, or what the relationship was between the poem and the film?
Well, Martha was now is actually writing a lot more actual page poetry, but then she's like an auteur video poet, does it all herself completely. So, and I, as far as I know, that wasn't a poem on the page at all. No, it was created for that film. So, yeah.
And then in the chat, let's see, we have one from, okay, so it says, I'm a Victorianist and my current studies involving novels rather than poetry. However, I'm also a performer and voiceover, and I'm fascinated by what you were saying about the placement of voice in the poetry film. So it says, how is the film usually made? Is the poet the filmmaker and the voice, or do different filmmakers work in different waves? And how influential is each participant typically? And you hinted at a little bit that sometimes the poets might not always be, they might have a little bit of question around what happens with the poem when it becomes a film poem. But anyway, do you want to say a little bit more about this then, the different participants?
Yeah, I mean, a poet has to be quite brave and generous, I think. Lucy English did this with the Book of Hours. You don't have to start with a poem, but let's say conventionally you do, and then you have the images and then the sound, but you could start with the soundscape and write a poem to a soundscape, or you could have images to a soundscape and find a poem. There isn't really an order exactly, and actually whoever's voice would work best, or how that voice is, as Martha did, you know, she created these distancing effects. Those all sort of sometimes just materialize during the process. There are people who work in teams, you know, definitely work in teams. Some work, now we're seeing films with hair and makeup at Zebra, you know, with big budget poetry films, which is something which we can all get quite worked up about. Over, you know, but I won't talk about that at the moment. But so you can begin wherever you really want to begin. A poem can be like a script, and people do take people's poems and actually chop them around. So literally anything is possible, really.
Yeah. There's another question then here, if we might come back to elucidating some of the differences, again, between poetry film and video poetry. Do you want to try to stake out that landscape a little bit for us?
Well, I mean, it is quite an Tom kind of identified this. And as I say in the book, it's a difficult area sometimes to quantify because, and I think he was questioned on this in the autumn when he gave a talk, really, which was that the concept of not religiously following the poem is we can all recognize that, but there are areas which are very crossover and grey, like for example mine, which you haven't seen, which is Selfie with Marilyn. It has a fully fledged poem going through it, but yet it's not a conventional poetry film. So he's made criteria which are sometimes quite hard to actually ascertain whether a film is a video poem or a poetry film. And in that case, then I would call it a poetry film if there was an uncertainty.
Should we show your Selfie with Marilyn really quick? So we still have that one in the queue.
It is about a minute long, so it depends whether you've got, it was just to show, that was when we were going to be talking about time, and this was how you could break up a poem, as we were just saying, not just, you can actually break up the poem in different ways, and this is quite an unusual way, but
yeah, let's show it, and then we can come back to, there's a final question here, which might be a good one to end on, about advice for a poet who might want to start experimenting with film in this way. So, all right, let's show Selfie with Marilyn, and then we'll come back to this last question. Oh, well, we're skipping Velocidade.
yes, and that one. Unfortunately.
I would like to say something to this woman I once knew when she was a red-haired girl. I borrowed this smile for the day. This is what happens when you take. I'm a flash in the pan. Oh shit. I would like to say something to this woman I once knew. Like the arrow when she was a red-haired girl. I borrowed this smile for like the arrow car or the hydro bomb. It's a little or gold nail polish torn at the seams. All the glimmers. I would like to say something to this woman I once knew when she was a red-haired girl. I borrowed this smile for the day. It's a little worn and torn at the seams. Sometimes I hardly know what to do with myself. But lipstick helps.
There you go.
All right, so one final question then. The advice that you might offer to a poet who might like to start making poetry films?
Yeah, if you've got a iPhone, I hate to keep saying it as if we all do, but if you've got a phone with a camera and some videoing, just literally go and experiment, get some footage together. You can get on iMovie or some, I like Video Leap. It's very accessible. You don't have to have a complex editing package. You can record your voice, other people's voices. You can throw them all into the mix and you can get free music online, free from different sources, free footage from different sources, old footage. And you'll soon find that you can create something. And as long as it's, you can remain loose and try not to make something corny. And that's really all we ask. Not too many people walking along the shoreline to piano. I would say avoid that.
Good advice.
Even though that could work, but it depends how you're going to do it, doesn't it? And yes, so yes, literally get some sort of, or work with someone else, find some filmmakers too, sometimes it's wonderful to work in a couple, in a collaboration, I think.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone out in the audience. Since we can't hear from you in an audible way right now, if you want to just put a quick thanks in the chat or whatever you're feeling, we'd just love to see that. And thank you so much for coming. And if you're interested in more events like this, you can follow the Bristol Poetry Institute on Twitter at UOBrisBPI. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, the chat is just really enthusiastic about everything you had to say, Sarah. It's lovely.
Oh, really? Have you got a copy?
Yeah, I'll get a copy. I'll send it. So, all right. So we'll say goodbye to everybody now. Thanks so much. Have a great night.